Good evening. So, welcome to the public lecture organized by the Institute for Mathematical Sciences at the NUS. My name is Chong Chi Tat. I'm the director of the IMS. So, before the lecture begins, let me just say a few words about our speaker for tonight, Professor Philip Protter from Columbia University. Professor Protter studied at Yale in mathematics, and then subsequently went to UC San Diego to get his PhD. And I guess broadly classified as probability, although it was more specifically in stochastic differential equations. And as we were talking, I discovered that actually our paths had crossed 40 years ago. Professor Protter was then an undergraduate at Yale, finishing his degree, and I was a graduate student. Of course, perhaps we have met in those days. Anyway, so after the PhD, Philip Protter went to Duke University as an assistant professor, and then after that continued to Purdue, and then Cornell, where he became a professor at Cornell in mathematics and statistics, and also director of financial engineering. He moved to Columbia University in 2010. Was it 11? 2010, right. Now, Professor Protter has had a very distinguished career. He is currently a fellow of the IMS Institute for Mathematical Statistics. He was the inaugural or founding lecturer of the prestigious von Mises lecture at the University of Humboldt, and he was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and he has published more than 100 papers, 3 books, 2 of which were co-authored and widely popular. He is on the editorial board of many journals, including the Annals of Probability, Annals of Applied Probability, and of course Mathematical Finance. He was the chief editor of Stochastic Processes and their Applications. And his areas of research, of course, in probability theory and stochastic calculus, stochastic differential equations, Markov processes, weak convergence, limit theorems, and so on and so forth. I think the list goes on. And tonight he's going to talk. Well, the title of the talk is What Really Happened in 2008 and Why. And I hope that in the end he will assure us that this will not happen again. Please welcome Professor Protter.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and it's very nice to be here. It's my first time in Singapore. This is only the second Asian country I've ever been to, and it's quite exciting, and it's a great honor to be giving this public lecture. So, the reason I got interested in what happened in 2008 was because I was alive in 2008, and my sister wrote me an email asking me what was going on. She asked me in kind of a more colorful way, which I won't repeat. But so I decided to of course, answer her email, and I discovered that I wasn't really sure what was going on. And so I started to organize my thoughts and do some research, and eventually I did the research that created this talk tonight. So that doesn't work. Probably it's this. Okay. So to go back, I think to understand what happened in 2008, we need a little history. And so we'll start with the Great Depression. And the Great Depression, of course, everyone knows, started in 1929 with the spectacular stock market crash in New York. And the seeds of it were Florida land speculation in the early 1920s when promoters were selling beautiful seaside land where you could build gorgeous buildings that turned out to be swampland in the middle of Florida. And of course, people would buy this without actually going to Florida because it wasn't so easy to go to Florida, and basically nobody wants to go to Florida. And then this sort of segued into stock market speculation. There was just a lot of easy money floating around, and very easy to get a loan, and you could buy stocks on leverage in the second half of the 1920s. And so this created a bubble, a financial bubble of the stock market, and it ended in the stock market crash of 1929. Now what happened in the stock market crash is that all of this money that was loaned was not paid back. And both for the Florida land and for buying stocks. And so this led to bank failures, and bank failures led to runs on banks. And because if you have your money in a bank and the bank is at risk of failing, you want to take your money out before it fails and you lose your money. So there were runs on banks, and so there were hundreds and hundreds of bank failures around the United States. And people lost a lot of money, and then people lost jobs, and credit became tight, and the economy stalled. This is a picture of the crash of 1929. Okay, and the reason for all these bank failures was irresponsible behavior of banks and insufficient capital reserves of banks. So this was actually recognized by the United States government, which, if you know the United States government now, you might find extremely difficult to believe. But back then, they took pains that this would never occur again. And so there were congressional investigations, and the congressional investigations resulted in many new laws, as well as the creation of new institutions. So the most important law, I think, that came out of the Great Depression was the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. And this created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, known by its devotees as the FDIC. And the Federal Deposit Insurance creation insured accounts at banks. So if you had your money in your local bank, you knew that if the bank failed, you would be paid back by the federal government. If the federal government failed, well, then the game is over, and you might as well just give up. So the fact that the federal government was insuring the bank gave people confidence that there was no need to have a run on a bank. You didn't have to rush to get your money out because your money was safe, okay, guaranteed by the national government, up to a certain amount, which was vastly adequate for ordinary people. Another thing that came out of the Depression was the creation of the SEC, or the Securities and Exchange Commission, and in 1934, and this led to the regulation of stocks and also such things as margin requirements. So margin requirements were taken much more seriously, and of course margin means that you can it used to be you could put 5%, 10% down, and then borrow the rest and buy stock, and if the stock market's going up, you make a lot more money than if you had to buy the stock outright, because you only pay a little bit and then you get all the profits from a small investment. But of course, once the stock market goes down, then the stock is your collateral for the loan that you bought, and the value of the stock goes down, so your collateral goes down, and your margin is called, and the person who lent you the money wants its money back before you don't have collateral anymore. And so leverage, when markets are going down, is a catastrophe. So if you do borrow on leverage, you have to hope that markets keep going up forever. Another rule that the government passed was no bank holding companies. So this is to prevent banks from becoming too big to fail, which is a phrase we hear a lot today. Okay, so for example, we already had a law from 1927, actually, coincidentally, that allowed banks only to be in one state. Of course, the United States has 50 states, and now it does. It didn't in 1929, but now we have 50 states. So you could only have one bank per state, and this was to what the bankers were worried. Actually, this is a law that the bankers wanted, because otherwise they felt that the New York banks would be the only banks in the country, which you see happening in countries like in France, for example, or Japan. There's like only a few banks for the entire country, right? But in the United States, there was a bank for every state, at least one, usually many more than one, because you didn't have these huge banks that could just dominate the whole banking system. In New York State, you could only have one bank per county. So counties are rather small. When I worked at Cornell, that was in Ithaca County, and the population of Ithaca County is around 150,000 people. So you could, if you were a bank it's actually Tompkins County, but if you were a bank in Tompkins County, the county that Ithaca is in, that was your world. You could not expand to any other county. And the reason they did this was the same reason, actually, because they were worried that the banks in New York City would dominate the entire state. And in fact, New York City is 5 counties. You know, it's there's Kings County, there's Queens County, and Manhattan County. So even New York City couldn't have a bank for all of New York City. At the time, it had to have one bank for Manhattan, a bank for Brooklyn, a bank for the Bronx, and so on. I don't know if you ever saw the Eddie Murphy movie, Coming to America. He's a prince in Africa, and he's coming to America to find a queen. And so, of course, he goes to Queens County. I mean, it's the obvious place to go. The pun about being a queen is totally not noticed. Okay, so now, of course, back in the day, the money used to be backed by gold and by silver. And on every dollar bill, there was a statement that said, you know, that we could exchange this dollar bill for a certain weight in silver, which meant that whatever the price of silver was, that's what a dollar was worth. And of course, that limited the money supply, because your money supply is limited to how much gold and silver you have. And so you can't keep expanding the money supply. And of course, this was why the New World was discovered, was because Europe had run out of gold. And had just been, and was just the money supply had been completely constrained. And so if you discover more gold, say in Peru or Mexico, then you can expand the money supply and prosper, which is what Spain did. So they changed the money, also, after World War II, they changed the law so that money had to say, "In God we trust." Because I think it wasn't until World War II that the United States realized that God was on our side. And so they said, "In God we trust," and so this is a cartoon that says that now we don't no longer trust in God, we trust in the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Okay. Now, in the 1970s, it became very stylish to deregulate. Now, the reason, of course, a capitalist country has regulations is that laissez-faire capitalism has a lot of problems, right? So, for example, if you have a highly competitive industry that pollutes the rivers and streams, and your particular company, you want to be a good company and you don't want to pollute the rivers and streams, so you institute policies not to pollute. If all your competitors pollute, well, then you're going to make less profits because you have to go to all this extra expense not to pollute. And of course, you will be fired as the CEO of that company. The shareholders will rebel and put in somebody who pollutes and makes more money. So it's impossible to have policies that benefit the society as a whole if you just rely on the responsibility and the goodwill of capitalists, because even if they possess that, and there's some argument about whether they do or not, but even if they possess that, they cannot actually do it in a competitive environment. So, so regulations, so you can have clean water and clean air if the government says nobody can do it, because then nobody's at a competitive disadvantage, and they have to, of course, they have to have enforcement and serious penalties to make sure it doesn't happen, and then we have clean water and clean air. So regulation actually serves usually a valid purpose, and the United States government is very anti-regulation, in spite of what the rhetoric. It's very hard to get regulations enforced or even enacted. And so when a regulation is enacted, it's always in response to a serious problem that needs to be addressed. Maybe it's the wrong solution to the problem, but it's an attempt to solve a serious problem. Nevertheless, people began to rebel against regulation, and one of the fathers of the anti-regulation was the economist named Alfred E. Kahn. And he convinced President Carter to deregulate the airlines. So before the airlines were deregulated in 1978, they were regulated. All fares were regulated. Where they flew was determined by the government. They decided what cities had to be served and what cities could be ignored. And there was and the competition was basically service. And good quality, a reputation for having well-maintained airplanes and a pleasant staff, and the system worked extremely well. And then President Carter deregulated the airlines, and consequently airfare is often quite cheaper and much less reliable. In 1980, President Reagan thought this was a spectacular idea to deregulate. And he deregulated the savings and loan industry. Now, the savings and loan industry was part of the banking system. It was required to lend money only to people buying houses. A lot of companies have a banking sector that only lends for mortgages so that people can buy houses. That was all it could do. The interest rate it could charge was regulated by the government. The interest rate it could offer to savers was regulated by the government, as was the interest rate by banks. And to encourage people to put money in savings and loans, they would pay a higher rate of interest than banks. Since they couldn't compete for savers by raising interest, they competed by offering a free toaster. So if I think my mother had several toasters, because if you opened an account at a savings and loan, you got a free toaster. The other way they competed was to compound interest rates more frequently. So they used to be compounded quarterly, then they started compounding monthly, and then some banks offered compounded daily, and then one bank, Fidelity Savings and Loan in California, offered continuous compounding. And they actually lost customers because, as it turns out, most people in America at that time had never studied calculus. So they did not know how to take a limit, and they didn't trust, they could imagine maybe compounding every second if you're really quick, you're really quick. And, but continuously was just not a concept people could relate to, and of course you have to trust a bank. Banks, even with the FDIC, people still wanted to trust their bank, and this bank was up to no good if it was saying you could do things that you can't do. So they stopped doing that. They reverted to daily, but I had it on pretty good authority that they really did do it continuously, because then it's just e to the RT. It's actually easier to compute the interest rate continuously than compounded daily. Of course, now with computers, anything's easy. But so the way it worked was savings and loan insurance at the time. Your account at a savings and loan was insured up to $100,000. If you had $200,000 you wanted in insured savings, you could just open 2 accounts at 2 different banks. So it was a really good system. You were always safe. And they provided loans for mortgages. Now, what Reagan did, which was extremely clever, was he kept the insurance, but stopped the regulation. Okay? And what this meant was that, if Freddie Delbain and Marcel Nutz and Jin Ma and I are all extremely rich people, and there are extremely rich people in the United States. I understand there are some in Singapore, too. And so we get together and we say, let's buy a savings and loan. And Freddie's wife Rita says, why buy a savings and loan? I said, well, if we buy a savings and loan, then we can use its capital to invest in any risky adventure we want to invest. If it works, because it's so risky, we'll make a lot of money. If it falls on its face and we lose our shirts, we're insured, right, by the government for up to $100,000. So we'll just open a lot of different accounts, and boy, you know, we can gamble without risk. So Reagan created a situation which made arbitrage possible. The other thing he did was with this system, people often were not that blatant. They would do things in more subtle ways. So let's suppose that Marcel Nutz is a developer. He's building shopping centers. So he comes to me and he says, I want to build a shopping center. I say, okay, how much money do you need to build a shopping center? He says, $200 million. And I say, well, okay, so he builds cheap shopping centers. You know. Obviously, he doesn't build them in Singapore. He probably builds them in Texas or Arizona. So he builds these crappy shopping centers that are going to fall down. And he spends $50 million. So I say, all right, I'll give you a loan for $50 million, but take $100 million. Give me back $25 million, put it in the Cayman Islands. You know, I have an account right next to Romney's account, perfectly fine. And then you know, keep $25 million for yourself, and everybody wins. So Marcel says, he's Swiss, so he says, okay. And you know, everybody wins. And when the savings and loan goes bankrupt because $50 million was the right amount of money, and now it has debt of $100 million, who cares? Everything's insured by the government. So this was the situation, and so we had savings and loans going broke right and left, usually in the Southwest, you know, Texas, Arizona. And so the cost of the crisis to the United States was the biggest cost up to this time of $160 billion. 1,043 banks went bankrupt, and altogether they were holding assets of $519 billion. This is a huge disaster. But the Republicans were in power, so nobody cared. Now this, unfortunately, this is a little bit out of focus. It was taken with an iPhone 3. But if you can see that plaque above the urinal, this is in a movie theater in Ithaca, New York. Alfred E. Kahn was a professor of economics at Cornell, very rich guy because he was a deregulator under Carter, you know. And so he donated this urinal to the movie theater, which is great because this means when you go to New York, if you're male, okay, only if you're a man, right? Then you can urinate on Alfred E. Kahn. And it doesn't get much better than that. Okay, so he's responsible for, of course, he doesn't see it this way. Well, he's dead, but he didn't see it this way, that he was responsible for so many of our problems, but he is. Okay, so now, of course, Reagan started the problem, but George H.W., as opposed to George W. I call him George the Elder. So George H.W. Bush was president when the savings and loan crisis really peaked. Now, it's not well known, but he has 5 children, actually. George W., who became president, Jeb, who became governor of Florida, Neil, and Marvin, who nobody ever talks about, and a daughter, Dorothy, who nobody ever talks about. Neil Bush was a bank robber. Now, can you imagine being the president of the United States and having your son a bank robber? It's really kind of astonishing. But Neil Bush, the brother of George Bush, who became president, the son of the sitting president, was a director of the Silverado Savings and Loan, which collapsed and lost $1 billion, all paid for by taxpayers, because of theft and corruption. And the government itself claimed that Neil Bush had engaged in numerous, quote, breaches of his financial duties involving multiple conflicts of interest. This is very nice euphemism for saying he's a bank robber. But not a bank robber in the John Dillinger sense, where you walk in with a gun and say, give me your money. There's a quote from the famous play, The Emperor Jones, right? Where the Emperor Jones says, if you're a little crook, they cut off your hand and throw you in prison. If you're a big crook, they make you emperor. So, the modern bank robber is personified by Neil Bush. So what do you do if your son is robbing a bank and it's headlines all over the country? How do you change the subject? You start a war. War trumps everything. So we started a war. We went to war. This was the first Iraq War. Because, you know, if his father started an Iraq War, the son has to start an Iraq War. So this is George Bush with his brother Neil. Okay? Neil has the bigger smile because Neil's richer. Okay, so Reagan's end to regulations meant that banks no longer had to hold the mortgages. You see, under regulation, if you were the Tompkins Trust Company, the bank in Ithaca, and you lent money to Philip Protter who bought a house, you had a 30-year mortgage, you kept that mortgage for 30 years, and you collected his payments, you know, and then you would take that money you got and you would pay people interest on their deposits, and the difference in the two interest rates was your profit. That was the model, and it worked well. But when deregulation started, it was really stupid to hold mortgages. You could sell them to a government company, quasi-government company, Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, which would take the mortgages off your hands, and you got a fee for writing the mortgage, and you got a fee for selling the mortgage, and then you could write more mortgages, and you weren't limited by how many mortgages you could write by actually having money. You see. Okay, and you didn't have to worry about whether the person was going to pay off the loan or not, because that was somebody else's problem once you sold it. Now, one of the problems with mortgages in America is that people move all the time. I mean, you heard the introduction. You know, I was in graduate school, then I got my first job in North Carolina, then I spent a year in Princeton, New Jersey, then I got a job in Indiana, then I got a job in Ithaca, New York, now I have a job in Manhattan. This is what we do in the United States. We build our houses of wood. You know, in France, they build their houses of stone, and they don't move. Because in France, you have Paris. I mean, that's it. Where are you going to move? So, but in America, it's a big country. Everybody's always moving around, trying to follow their jobs. So when you sell a house, you know, I lived in my house in Ithaca for 10 years, and now I've sold it. I have a 30-year mortgage. I don't want to pay mortgage payments for 20 years when I don't even own the house anymore. So the system in America is you can prepay the mortgage at any time you want to. So when interest rates go down, you prepay the mortgage and you get a new mortgage at a lower interest rate. When you change jobs and move to a new city, you prepay the mortgage and you sell your house and you buy a new house in a new city. That's the way it works. But if you're an investor and you're looking for a cash flow and you have a 30-year mortgage, you say, oh, this is a good deal. This is a good cash flow. I like this deal. But you don't know when the deal is going to stop, because the mortgage can be prepaid at any time. So you can't really sell a mortgage. Banks couldn't sell mortgages because there was just too insecure an investment for an investor. So, but now, since the banks didn't have to sell the mortgages anymore, they could be packaged into what was called an asset-backed security, which economists, statisticians love acronyms. But the difference between economics and economists love acronyms. The difference between economists and statisticians is that economists use 3 letters in their acronyms, and statisticians use between 5 and 7. You know, so you have the uniformly most powerful unbiased estimator, But asset-backed security is just ABS, right? It sounds like a Singapore bank or something. So anyway, so we have these asset-backed securities. Well, asset-backed securities were a collection of 4,000 to 7,000 mortgages. So they would have all of these mortgages, and you wouldn't take 4,000 mortgages from Ithaca, New York, because if Ithaca, New York has two employers, Cornell University and Ithaca College, and if they both went bankrupt, then of course the bottom would fall out of the housing market. Nobody would want to live there anymore. And there's little towns in North Carolina that have one factory and that's it. And so, you take mortgages from all around the country and you put them together, and therefore you have a lot of security because they come from all these different sources. A disaster is not going to happen to all of them at once, 7,000 mortgages. They're not all going to be prepaid at once. So you have a reasonably high assurance that some of the mortgages are going to last the whole 30 years because there's some people who just never move, right? Like Nizar Tusi. You're never going to move. He lives in Paris. Why would he move? Where's he going to move to? You're going to move to Orleans? So he's never going to move. So unless he has 5 more children, and then he may move. All right, so these ABSs, you conglomerate all these mortgages into one security. And then you slice it up into slices. But when you're speaking in English, everything sounds much more sophisticated if you use French. Okay? So last night I called Jin Ma a bon vivant. That sounds much better than a good time Charlie. It just sounds sophisticated. So we don't call them slices, we call them tranches. So which is the French word for slice. So you divide these, you take these slices or tranches, and you have 3 to 5 tranches. You have a bottom tranche, a middle tranche, and an upper tranche. Okay, but the upper tranche you call the senior tranche, because senior it just sounds better than upper, right? Upper sounds vaguely like amphetamines or something. So then of course there's the super senior tranche, which is even better than the senior tranche. Okay, so the bottom tranche is like equity. And then you order these things. So if somebody prepays its mortgage or defaults on his mortgage, the bottom tranche gets hit first. And only when the bottom tranche is totally wiped out do we go to the middle tranche, and then that starts to get hit. And when the middle tranche is totally wiped out, then we go to the senior tranche, and that starts to get hit. Well, the senior tranche never starts to get hit because you have 7,000 mortgages. What's the probability that they're all going to go bankrupt or they're all going to prepay? It's essentially zero, assuming that all the mortgages are independent and from different parts of the country and people are making decisions for totally different reasons. So it's really only the first tranche that's in danger. And Salomon Brothers realized all this and had a model on how to price it and made tons and tons of money in the 1980s when they were selling these things. And the top tranche was so safe that it was basically as safe as treasury bonds. So therefore it paid around the same interest as treasury bonds. It was as safe as the US government. Nobody was ever going to touch the top tranche. And so if there weren't enough treasury bonds to buy, then you can buy one of these asset-backed security top tranches. And there's a lot of companies that can own AAA rated. There are a lot of companies that can only buy AAA rated things by law. Things like pension funds or various kinds of insurance companies. They're not allowed to put their workers' money at high risk. And so this is a model of you have all of these different bonds, which can be thought of as mortgages, for example. They don't have to be though anymore. And then you have a sponsor that's selling the bond portfolio. The sponsor could be Merrill Lynch, or one of those big banks, and goes into a special purpose vehicle, SPV. Then you have the equity tranche. That's the bottom tranche, even though it's at the top of my picture. That's around 40% of the bonds. The mezzanine tranche is around 20% of the bonds. And of course, you can ask for a higher interest rate on the mezzanine than you can on the equity tranche. Then you have the mezzanine tranche 2, the mezzanine tranche 3, and so on. And finally, you get to the senior tranche, which pays a much lower rate of interest because it's reasonably safe. Okay? And you rate it, and it can be rated between AAA and AA. So this was how an asset-backed security worked, and it actually worked pretty well. And it makes a lot of sense. Okay, and so the top tranche was very safe of an ADS. Mortgage standards were very high. I mean, when you went to America, when I got my loan for my house 13 years ago in Ithaca, I had to show proof of employment. I had to show every single debt I had: credit card debt, automobile debt, personal debt, any kind of debt. I had to show them that. I had to show them everything I owned. I had to show lots of things, right? It wasn't quite like going through one of those new security screening things where they look at you naked, you know, but it was almost that. I mean, it was really a very close examination. The house itself was examined and assessed. There was title. People had to do a search to make sure that the person selling me the house actually had the right to sell the house, that he had title to the house, that there were no liens on the house from his own mortgages, and so on. So it was a very serious activity, buying a house, and a lot of work went into making sure that it was a correct negotiation. And so the top tranche was very safe, and it was rated AAA. Now, after the savings and loan disaster hit, which was it was really a big disaster. I mean, nobody talks about it anymore. We've forgotten all about it. But at the time, it was talked about a lot. And then the Iraq War made it all disappear, which was, I think, one of the main functions of the Iraq War, was to make the savings and loan insurance catastrophe disappear from the news. It was extremely effective. In fact, when Neil Bush was finally prosecuted and fined for helping to bankrupt a $1 billion savings and loan, he was fined $50,000, which is actually very impressive. I mean, the son of a president, the brother of another president, and he's still fined, okay, $50,000. It was on page 32 of the New York Times. In the bottom right corner, and it was a little article about this big with a very small headline. How do I know this? Well, in those days, I actually read the New York Times fairly carefully. I don't know why. But, you know, I was reading it, I said, oh, here he is. So at any rate, so just like in 1929, after the stock market crashed, the government made a thorough investigation and decided that the system was broken and came up with really intelligent ways to fix it. And as you see from my slide, that's not the case. No lessons at all were learned from the savings and loan crisis. No reforms were made at all. The only change was that the FDIC started changing insurance amounts on banks from $100,000 to $250,000. So now your banking accounts are insured to $250,000. And then, since, you know, I would like to only blame Reagan, Bush the elder, and Bush the younger, but I have to blame Clinton too. And I'm personifying the whole government into presidents, but it's actually also the Congress, of course. So the Reagan-Neal Act of 1994 was passed under President Clinton, which allowed interstate banking. So this meant that the 1927 McFadden Act that prohibited interstate banking was repealed because it was, after all, it's a regulation. And so this means that the big banks in California, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, the big banks in North Carolina, which strangely is a highly industrialized state, like Wachovia Bank, and the big banks in New York, like Citibank and Chase Manhattan, could therefore buy up all the other banks. So for example, in West Lafayette, Indiana, where Purdue University is, there was a very adorable little bank called Purdue National Bank. And I used it because the banking building was designed by the architect Neil Sullivan, who was one of the first architect in America to build a skyscraper, which was, I think, more than 6 stories tall, because it was right after Otis. We had elevators, but we didn't have, until Otis, was brakes on elevators, you know, so that if the cable broke, the elevator would just fall all the way to the bottom. So Otis created a brake on elevators to prevent them from falling, and that's what made skyscrapers possible, that and steel. And so, Louis Sullivan, he was a wonderful architect. He was the teacher of Frank Lloyd Wright, who's much more famous than Louis Sullivan. But anyway, he designed the Purdue National Bank building in West Lafayette, Indiana. So first thing, in 1994, as soon as this law was passed, Bank One of Ohio bought Purdue National Bank. And Bank One became a very big bank, which was then bought by, I think, North Carolina National Bank, which I don't know what happened to that bank. Maybe it still exists. And so before Reagan-Neal, we had very few big banks. Bank of America was a very big bank. There are a few big banks in New York, there are a couple of big banks in Chicago, and that was it. And after this, a number of banking institutions decreased not by failure, but by being purchased by 3,288, or 27%. So, and it's been constantly shrinking as more and more banks are bought up. Consequently, what I do now is I try to buy stock in small banks, because eventually they're going to be bought out at a nice price. Just have to be patient. Then, again under President Clinton, they passed the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act of 1999, which meant that bank holding companies can now own other financial companies. So there was this wall between banking and investment banking. These were different activities, not allowed to touch each other. So Lazard Frères and Company, and my mind just went blank, but some of the other investment houses could not do banking, and banking could not do investment. So once that wall went down, banks could do everything, right? So they became full-service banks. And it also meant that anyone could be a bank. And often anyone did become a bank, right? You know, rich people could get together and become a bank. There are lots of financial advantages to becoming a bank, and you can become richer. And there's one principle about being rich in America, or probably anywhere, is the richer you are, then you're not rich enough. You know, like a successful academic generally feels rich enough. But if you're really rich, you're not rich enough, because you can have all these expenses. You have to have 5 or 6 homes. You have to have a home in the south of France. You have to have a home in Paris. You have to have a home in New York. I was just talking to Peter Phillips, who's here in Singapore this afternoon, and he explained that if you're very, very rich, you have to own a beach in New Zealand. Who knew? Well, if you're going to have a beach in New Zealand, a ranch in Montana, a home in New York, right? Probably a little place in Singapore so you can avoid paying taxes, and maybe a home in Paris and one on the Riviera. Well, then you need staff to maintain all these homes, right? You need walls around them to prevent the riffraff, or as we say in Singapore, the riffraffles, from entering these places, right? And so you have, then you need an airplane to fly between them, right? And then you need a staff for the airplane. You have a lot of expenses. You have to make sure that your children aren't kidnapped and held for ransom, you know, by Somali pirates or whatever. So, I mean, it's an ugly lifestyle being rich, right? And so you have to get very, very rich to try to maintain some decorum in this incredibly ugly lifestyle you've created for yourself. So rich people just need to get richer and richer and richer. And so they buy banks, or they create banks. And the old wall separating financial activity disappeared. So this is the background to what's going to happen. Okay. Now, Another part of the background is what's called in very polite society incentive conflicts. An incentive, most people would call this just corruption, right? But we economists call it incentive conflicts. So in 1970s, it was felt that company managers did not have the interests of the stockholders at heart. Well, this was certainly true. I mean, this was obviously a problem. To solve this problem, and to better align their interests with the interests of the stockholders, who actually technically own the company, the form of executive compensation, which is a very fancy word for salary, the executive compensation you would get was altered to allow you to be paid with stock options. And they would be in the money only if the stock price rose. And this led to a large increase in executive compensation. This is a graph of the chief executive compensation. Chief executive officer, his pay as a multiple of the average worker's pay of his own company. So, as you can see, in the 1960s, it was about 40 times. You made about 40 times what a worker in your company made. Okay? Still the case in Germany 5 years ago. And then in the year 2000, you made over 500 times what a worker made in your company. Okay? So executive pay really went out of control. And in the year 2000, average CEO compensation was 1,000 times what a worker in your company made, going up from 40 in 1970. In 2006, the CEOs of the top 25 CEOs in compensation in the United States, their compensation ranged from $42 million to $635 million in 1 year. Now, you can imagine the cost. Supposing you're making $42 million, you're paying an executive $42 million to run your company. What happens if that executive is constipated or gets diarrhea? Do you know how much that costs the company? You know, I mean, people think about these things. I mean, if you look at how much they make per minute, it's insane. The year Richard Fullman drove Lehman Brothers into bankruptcy and destroyed the world economy, he was paid $54 million for his efforts. Now, this doesn't sound like much money because 54 is a number we can all relate to. I used to be 54 years old. I know the number 54. It's not a big number. I used to think it was. Now I don't. But, and $1 million, well, you know, my apartment in New York is worth more than $1 million. It's not such a big number, right? So 54 is not a big number, $1 million is not a big number, you multiply them, what's the big deal? Right? But it's a very, very big amount of money, $54 million in 1 year. That's 1 year. Now, but you know, if only the CEOs got all this money, there might be a rebellion. But they spread it around. This is a very clever system. So you know, you can't be making $100 million and have your second in command making $100,000. It just doesn't work. So everybody, all the management of the company has to make a lot of money. So where does this money come from? It doesn't come from profits. Isn't that amazing? Sometimes they're paid all this money when companies are losing money. So where does the money come from? You know, if you went to a bank and you said, even today, if you went to a bank and you said, I'd like to borrow $100 million, they say, okay, how do you want to invest it? Oh, I don't want to invest it. I just want to pay my CEO. You know, I need to borrow $100 million because we don't have any profits and I have to pay my CEO and all of his cronies $100 million this year. A bank's not going to lend you $100 million to pay the CEO. So this money comes from the stockholders. Now remember, this system was designed to align the interests of CEOs with the stockholders. But the $100 million your CEO has paid comes from the stockholders. Why don't the stockholders rebel? They own the company. Because who are the stockholders? I'm a stockholder. Because I have a retirement fund. I don't control the retirement fund. Columbia University says you will invest in Vanguard or Fidelity. This is a free country, so you have your choice, Vanguard or Fidelity. If you drink Coca-Cola, Vanguard. If you drink Pepsi-Cola, Fidelity. So we have choice in our country. It's not like Singapore. So because everybody who works and has a pension, which is not everybody who works, everybody who works and has a pension in America, that pension is invested in the stock market. Maybe it's invested in real estate, but that's essentially the same thing because it's a real estate fund. And so, or it's invested in bonds, but it's a bond fund. You know, it's all funds, which means it all goes to Wall Street, which means that people manage it and they make all the money. So they skim the cream of the crop. So why don't we protest? Because we're millions and millions of disorganized people. And they're only taking 1% all the time. Who notices? So that's why there's nothing's done about it, I think. And the point is that new money keeps entering the stock market every month, right? Because every month I get paid, and I get money put into my retirement account, and that retirement account gets put in a mutual fund, and that mutual fund gets invested in the stock market, and that's more money going into the stock market. So coffers are constantly being replenished. Now, because the CEOs are paid in options, most primarily, there's a huge emphasis on the short run, right? Because the options will mature in 3 months, and you want the stock to go up. The more it goes up, the more you get in your option, right? Because it's a call option. So you get more money the faster it goes up. So you constantly focused on the short term. Now, if you can't make the stock go up legally, you make it go up illegally, right? You say, okay, well, we just had this huge sale, which should be booked next quarter, but if I book it this quarter, the stock will go up a lot, and I'll get a lot more profit. So you book things early, even when they haven't happened yet, sometimes on the expectation that they're going to happen. And so there's a real incentive to make a company's performance look better than it is. Now, this would never happen in one of the big, serious companies like Enron, which was the 7th largest company in the United States, or WorldCom, a huge company in the internet, or Global Crossing, a huge company in fiber optics. These are pillars of capitalist society in America. Adelphia in communication, Tyco in electronics, Health South, one of the biggest hospital companies. All of these companies went bankrupt due to sheer corruption of the extremely highly paid and compensated CEOs. Okay. This was, Dennis Kowalski was the president of Tyco. This is his mugshot after he was arrested. This is on the left, we have a picture of him during his Caligula party in Italy, when he had ice sculptures in Italy and flew all his friends, Berlusconi style, to Italy to have a huge party which he modeled after the Roman Emperor Caligula. I don't know if you know who Caligula was, but let's put it this way. They made lots of pornographic movies about him. And so this guy, the CEO of Tyco, who drove the company into bankruptcy, his credentials, he made his money as a used car salesman. Now, of course, it takes a lot of skill to sell a used car, because basically, if you're a highly successful used car salesman, it's like being a con man, right? You're convincing somebody that he absolutely has to have a 1957 Ford Thunderbird that doesn't run, because it's such an item. It's a collector's item. Okay, so the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act of 1999 opened the floodgates. We've discussed the incentive conflict, and then we have an incentive conflict with auditors, like in the case of Enron. Auditors, there's no government regulation. When a company reports its profits and how it's doing, There is no government regulation of that in the United States. None. This is inspected by the auditors. And there are only a few big, very big auditing companies, and they have tremendous integrity. And they investigate the companies and make sure everything is accurate. So, what the companies do is they hire the auditors. So let's suppose I'm an auditor, I'm working for Arthur Andersen, I'm making a very nice salary of $100,000 a year. I'm auditing Enron. Enron says, listen, you're really good at your job. We've noticed how good you are. We'd like you also to audit our books. We'll pay you $300,000. Keep your job at Arthur Andersen, and just do some consulting for us. It's worth a lot of money to us. We're a rich company. It's a lot of money if you'll audit for us. And then he has an incentive conflict because Enron wants him to do the right thing for Enron, and Arthur Andersen wants him to do the right thing because it's the right thing, right? And so that led to a huge corruption of the auditing system, which led to the downfall of Enron. Since then, the auditing system has been completely reformed, and the government has stepped in and created huge regulations on the auditing system, and it's now incredibly efficient and incredibly accurate. No. None of that happened. The government has left the auditing system completely untouched. All they did was pass Sarbanes-Oxley, which makes the CEO, who's making $100 million by being corrupt, sign a statement saying, I'm not corrupt. That's what the government did. So, but they learned from this. They realized that, oh my God, the rating system is a perfect structural analogy to the auditing system. There's only 3 auditing companies, there's only 3 rating agencies. By law, there's only 3 rating agencies: Moody's, Fitch, and Standard & Poor's. And these companies, there are more rating agencies, but they're not allowed to rate. So there's only 3 rating agencies that are allowed to rate, those 3. And their employees have salaries, but are allowed to consult. Okay? So they have the exact same structure as the auditing system. And here's a cartoon. How many sleazy rating agencies does it take to change a light bulb and wreck the global economy? Well, this is a joke in America. How many students at Yale does it take to change a light bulb? 3. 1 to call the electrician, and 2 to mix the drinks. And that was the joke when I was at Yale. But at any rate, so the answer is always 3. And in this case, it actually is 3. So, so we have 6 components to the crisis. We have the housing bubble, which nobody recognized was a bubble. We have the deregulation of controls for the writing of mortgages. We have the rating agencies using old models for the asset-backed securities. By old models, I mean they were still using the models that were created when banks were serious. And they had to investigate when you bought a house, and they had to keep the mortgage themselves, and there were strict rules on how to behave. The system worked quite well, and that's the model the rating systems were using when the system was completely broken, and anybody could write a mortgage. Then we have the executive search for short-term profits, no matter what, because that means more money for them. And then we have the relaxation of capital requirements for regulators, which I haven't got to yet. So the housing bubble began around 1970 in California, in San Diego, where I was in graduate school, and lasted on and off for 35 years. As prices continued to climb, people could buy more expensive homes. So, you buy a starter home for $150,000, then you start having some kids, your wife starts buying extra sets of dishes and too much furniture. So you buy a bigger house, right? And you can do this because your house, which was $150,000, is now worth $200,000. So you sell it for $200,000, you make $50,000 profit, plus whatever things you paid off in your mortgage. So let's suppose you have $75,000, you can put that down on a new home, and then get a nice big mortgage, and get a much nicer home, and move to a nicer neighborhood, better schools for your children, and so on. So, but for this system to work, salaries have to go up. And the entry-level homes have to remain affordable. because otherwise people can't buy the entry-level homes, and eventually there'll be no more people buying entry-level homes, and the whole system will collapse. Salaries go up because of union pressure on salaries, right? That's why salaries go up. If there's no union salary, there's no reason for salaries to go up. So they don't go up. So salaries, so to prevent salaries going up, you kill the union movement, which happened in America. The union movement was killed. So salaries are frozen. They haven't moved for decades. But prices have gone up, which means people are less and less able to afford what they used to be able to afford. So the entry level started to become unaffordable, and people can't buy their first home. So what do you do to continue the housing bubble? You continue it through creative financing. They say, oh, you don't have a job? That's okay. Or let's suppose that, that Professor Peng comes to America, he wants to buy a house, right? So he picks out this beautiful, beautiful house, right? And it costs $650,000. So I say, well, you know, $650,000, you're going to need monthly mortgage payments of around $10,000. What's your income? He says, I get $6,000 a month. And I said, well, you're going to need $10,000 to pay your mortgage payment, and you'll probably want some money to buy food. Plus there's utilities, you'll need at least 3 cars. I don't think you can buy it. So I'll tell you what. Why don't you just say you make $600,000 a year? Then you can afford this house. And Professor Peng, who's from China, says that would be a lie. And I said, well, in China it's a lie, but in America, you know, you say what you want to say. So he says, okay, $600,000, fine. And he says it. Now, in the old days, you had to show your pay stub. You had to prove that you made this money. Under the new regime, anything goes. So you can just say. So people were buying houses for $80,000. So Freddie buys a house for $80,000. He sells it the next day to Marcel for $300,000. The house is worth $80,000. It's a house in New Jersey, for Pete's sake. So Marcel pays $300,000 for this house, which he borrows from Bank of America, because anything goes. Then he says, you know, I don't want this house, and he walks away from the loan. So Freddie has $300,000. He pays himself back the $80,000. He has $220,000 left. He gives $100,000 to Marcel. He keeps $100,000 for himself, and he gives $10,000 to charity because he's a good man. Okay, and everybody wins, right? The bank loses, but the bank doesn't care because it's insured. So there was corruption. So now we're going to take a short break. Was I supposed to end like half an hour? By 7:30, okay. So we're going to, that's okay, it's only 7:35. So we're going to take a short break to show, so I can show you a movie. Oh yeah. Okay, so I have to show you the movie here. Okay, so this was a movie that was made in it's a short movie, 1997. And apparently the person making this movie wanted to convince people that there was a housing bubble going on. So he used a video game technology to plot the Case-Shiller Housing Index from 1890 to 2007 as a roller coaster ride. So this is we're riding along the top of the index, right? And you see that in the lower right corner here, over here, you see every so often, you'll see what year it is. Okay? So this is 1895, and then we're going to go up and down and up and down. And you'll see that what happens is that around 2000, and you see that throughout history we go up and down. Right? You really get a feel for how housing prices evolve in America. There's ups and downs and ups and downs. Then in 2000, the downs stop. And we just have it up. And you know, as escalators, as roller coasters go up steep hills, they get slower, and when they go down hills, they get faster. So this is reflected with this magnificent video gaming technology. And let's see, what year are we up to now? We're up to come on, 1950. So we're already up to 1950. And we're going up, and now we're sort of, now there's a little down, you know. Now we're 1960, leveling off. Then comes the Carter years. We start to go up, you know, as money gets looser. Deregulation begins to take hold. This is the California housing bubble time, right? We're going up and up and up, and then, you know, Reagan becomes president, everything falls apart. And we start to go down. And then Clinton becomes president, and everything, again, kind of falls apart, and we go down. People don't like change. And then, this is 1995, and then we start to go up. 1997, okay, and then we go up. And we just stop going down, because it's a new world. Housing prices will never go down. And you know, what people used to do was they used to buy a house. It became cheaper to buy a house and live in it for 3 years than to rent. Because people, to get you to buy a house, there would be teaser rates on the mortgage. There would be floating rate mortgages. The first 3 years, the mortgage would be very cheap, and then it would readjust after 3 years to a rather high rate. Okay? So what you did was, you refinanced after 3 years and got a new teaser rate. So you could live in your house indefinitely with a very cheap mortgage, as long as housing prices kept going up, because you had to be able to refinance. If housing prices went down, you couldn't pay off your loan because your house was no longer worth what your loan was worth. Also, you had no money down. You put no equity in whatsoever. There was no 10% or 20% down payment. Okay, and here we are at 2007, and this is when he put this video up, and you know, it wasn't clear what was going to happen after 2007, but now we know, right? Okay, so I forget how to make this. Yeah. Oh, God. I don't know how to make this full screen, so we'll just watch it. You do? Okay. It's PowerPoint. I'm not really used to PowerPoint. Is there? Oh, that's easy. Okay, so if you bought a new home, you had to keep your payments within reasonable bounds, and it was tied to your income. And then it was repackaged as an ABS. Standards became low, even non-existent, and it was cheaper to buy for 3 years and walk away after 3 years than to rent, and criminals entered. So I've gone over this. So then we entered. So these asset-backed securities were wonderful investments, but there just weren't enough of them because they were restricted. Their quantity was restricted by the number of mortgages, and there was so much demand by German banks, Swiss banks, French banks, all sorts of banks, as well as every American bank. They all wanted these things because they were paying higher interest rates than Treasury bonds, and they were rated AAA. So they created more by inventing collateralized debt obligations. So these were like asset-backed securities, but they were a derivative in the sense that asset-backed securities were their fundamental, and they were based on asset-backed securities. And then they made CDO squareds, which weren't backed by asset-backed securities, they were backed by CDOs. So these were also called virtual CDOs. So things were created out of whole cloth. And these were so popular that Magnetar, which was one of the hedge funds that was instrumental in making CDO squareds, people were spending 24 hours a day there, sleeping on the floor and eating takeout pizza so they could make CDO squareds around the clock because there was such huge demand for them. They're called synthetic CDOs. And so this created accounting problems, and it allowed people to hide debt. And if honest people couldn't see the debt, everybody thought companies were doing better than they were, which led to a rise in the stock price, which led to more executive compensation. So now so then the rating companies entered in. They were using out-of-date technology, which the hedge funds could exploit. And they were also corrupt, which everybody exploited. And so they were rating. So what would happen is that I would create a CDO, and I would say senior tranche should be AAA. And Moody's would say, your senior tranche is kind of garbagey, and I can't give it AAA. And he said, well, I know you work for Moody's, but you also work for me. Tell me what I can do to fix it. I'm paying you $300,000 a year. Tell me what I can do to fix it. So the guy thinks and says, well, if you move this out, move this in, it'll be okay. And that's how they got AAA rated super senior tranches of CDOs, is through this kind of corruption. And but also their technology was out of date. And they assumed, for example, that with the ABS you had 7,000 mortgages scattered around the country. These could be modeled as independent events. But you had the lack of independence with CDOs because they were based on things that depended on each other. And so the modeling was flawed because it assumed statistical independence when it was not a valid assumption. Okay, so, and the way this was done was a technique known as copulance, which has an unfortunate name. But at any rate, we'll skip this. The rating agencies were not regulated and they were corrupt. That's the bottom line. This is an example of a CDO term sheet, okay? And if you work for a bank like Merrill Lynch, if you work for an investment bank, and one of these became available, you had about 5 seconds to decide whether you wanted to buy it. It's very hard to read this, understand it, digest it, and decide whether it's a good investment in 5 or 10 seconds. Right? So these were the ratings 1 month before various companies had disasters. For example, Bear Stearns, before it had a disaster, Moody's rated it A2, S&P rated it A, Fitch rated it A+. Fannie Mae was rated by Fitch AAA, Freddie Mac was rated by Fitch AAA. AIG, very famous company now, was rated AA3, AA-, AA. These are pretty good ratings, They're not like junk. Okay, junk is C rating. These were mostly A's of some kind or another. WAMU stands for Washington Mutual. Okay, so then there were the capital reserve requirements of banks. So banks have basically, I'm going to speed up. So banks have capital reserves to prevent runs on banks. And so it's very annoying for a bank to have a capital reserve because imagine you have to have a capital reserve of 50%. You have an investment opportunity of $100,000 that's going to pay you off 10%. You'd like to make $10,000 on this investment opportunity. If you have to take $50,000 and put it in capital reserves, that $100,000 becomes $50,000. You make $5,000 on the investment opportunity. So you've tied up $100,000 on a 10% opportunity and you make 5%. So you want smaller capital reserves so you can make more money. So Goldman Sachs, bless its soul, convinced the SEC that if they invested in AAA rating, AAA securities, they didn't need any capital reserves at all because AAA ratings were like government bonds, right? So they invested in the super senior tranches of the CDOs and CDO squareds, which were AAA. And one of the things that made them AAA was they were insured by insurance companies. So even in the very unlikely event they failed, you had the insurance companies that would insure you and pay you off. And there were big, powerful insurance companies like AIG. What could go wrong? Well, it turned out nothing because the government gave AIG billions and billions and billions of dollars so that it could pay back Goldman Sachs at 100%. The reason it did that is that Goldman Sachs, you could only be an executive for like 20 years, and then you're kicked out, and you're told to go work for the government. So the government our government is completely full with former executives of Goldman Sachs, right? And so much so that when William Geithner, who was Secretary of the Treasury, was introduced, one of the early times he was introduced as a former executive of Goldman Sachs, even though he had never worked at Goldman Sachs. He had nothing to do with Goldman Sachs. He never worked in the private sector. He was a government, he worked at the Federal Reserve of New York, and before that he worked in the government. So, but Goldman Sachs was the one who was responsible, and because it's Goldman Sachs, it paid zero penalty whatsoever. Okay, and so George Bush, of course, had a big role, but I won't go there. Anyway, so the other thing is that they couldn't price things when the market disappeared. And the thing was that they had these illiquid investments, so they couldn't sell them. Nobody would buy them. So they didn't know how much, even if they wanted to have capital reserves, they didn't know what it was worth, so they didn't know how much to set aside because they didn't know the market value. In order to know the market value of something, there has to be a market. And when the market completely disappeared in 2008, banks couldn't value their assets. So the insurance companies, a lot of these insurance companies were called monoline. They were required to be monoline, which meant that you couldn't be a diversified insurance company. You couldn't have life insurance and automobile insurance and all these other kinds of insurance. You could only do financial insurance. And so therefore, the insurance companies were completely dependent on the health of the financial sector. This is okay. If a CEO by some fluke collapsed, the insurance company could pay you off. But if all the CEOs all at once collapsed, the insurance companies were screwed. The insurance companies were just taking in the money from the insurance policies. Every month you pay your insurance, right? But they weren't setting aside any capital to pay back if something happened. So when something happened, they just all went bankrupt, and that's that. Who cares? They're incorporated. Okay, so the summary is that we had the rating agencies. They were corrupt. They were out of date. We had the mortgage issuers. They were corrupt. They were unregulated. Profits depended on how much they sold, not on whether they sold good things. We had the issuers of CDOs. They were playing a ratings arbitrage game where they rated things AAA that were junk. And they got away with it because they bribed the rating agencies, which weren't supervised. And then we had the money managers, which were thinking only in the short run, so that they could get as much money as possible. So there was corruption and greed throughout the entire system and a complete absence of government regulation. And that's it. So I'll stop there. Oh, and since then, nothing's been done.
Well, thank you, Professor Protter, for very interesting and, let's say, deep analysis of what led to 2008 housing collapse, market collapse. And Professor Protter has dinner to go to. So perhaps just invite just one or two quick questions you can like to ask.
Yes?
May I ask how did the subprime crisis was related to the 2008 crash? The subprime.
How the subprime crisis
Yeah, the
contributed to 2008?
Yeah, because I thought that it was one of the contributing factors.
Yes, well, this is, okay, so a subprime mortgage is a mortgage where people don't have enough money to afford the mortgage, or it's they're buying a house that's too expensive, which is almost the same thing. So there was a movement in the government that every mortgages were like used car salesmen, and were very dishonest, and didn't explain it to them. So they thought that this was their mortgage payment, was what they were told now. When people buy a home, often, especially if they're unsophisticated, all they think about is how much do I have to pay each month? And it turned out what they had to pay each month wasn't that different from what they were paying in rent. And instead of having a landlord in a crappy apartment that smelled of insecticide and had ugly neighbors, they were living in a house with a yard and better schools and everything for the same amount of money. So of course they did that. And so somebody would do it, and then he would tell his friends, and his friends would say, yeah, that sounds great. They would do it. And it was very easy to do it. And then 3 years would come by, and they'd get a letter from the mortgage saying that, your mortgage payment has gone from $1,000 a month to $3,000 a month. And they wouldn't know what to do. So those were the subprime mortgages, okay? That people didn't have the adequate income to buy the house. Now, in the old days, the people making the mortgages would know that because they would ask for proof of income and they would care about it because the bank selling the mortgage would keep the mortgage. They didn't want somebody defaulting. But in this new age, nobody cared. It was just packaged and sold as an ABS to Fannie Mae, who sold it to investors. Investors didn't know what they were buying. So that's how the subprime mortgage, that was a large part of it, the subprime mortgage, because these were things that were going to default. But it's not such a big problem if it's properly priced. But it was the dishonesty and the lack of regulation that made it improperly priced and extremely incorrectly rated.
The last question.
Yeah, one more.
Just very nice talk. Thank you. So I'm originally from Finland. Beginning of 90s, we had in whole Scandinavia, Finland, massive banking crisis, much bigger than we have now had in US. And we didn't have any CDOs, no credit rating agencies, nothing like bankers didn't get much money. Probably I'm just saying that what is really the first order effect in creating this kind of crisis? It's probably not like creating CDOs and etc. It's something else because when let's say AAA assets are not anymore AAA, so then you have banking crisis, something like that. So I'm just saying that in Scandinavia, if you check your list, most of the items there we didn't have.
Yeah, actually, you did, but I'll because your banks bought American CDOs.
No. Okay, but in beginning of 90s, in Scandinavia we had massive banking crisis
Right.
in beginning of 90s. We didn't have CDOs, credit rating agencies.
Well, I don't actually know the details of how the banking system in Scandinavia works, but my guess is that that a lot of these elements were there. So you had improper or inadequate government regulation of the banks, inadequate capital reserves, and executives whose compensation was based on the short-term profits of the banks. So if that's the case, and I imagine it probably was, that would lead to irresponsible behavior of the banks in an attempt to boost up short-term profits at the expense of the long-term health of the banks. And this continues from short-term to short-term to short-term, and eventually you're undermining the health of the bank. I don't know in Scandinavia, I always idolized Scandinavia when I was young.
Okay, so not anymore.
Not anymore. That's not. But I imagine that there was some corruption too.
Thanks to everybody for spending this evening and for the public lecture.